Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's really a real pleasure to be here. My first visit to Penn, so thank you for doing that. So let me say something about what the talk's about. It's about teleology, the idea that there is such a thing as purpose or function in nature, independent of the human mind. And I'm going to start out arguing that you need that in biology, very briefly. Then there'll be a little excursion through the philosophy of mind to say that if that didn't convince you, you need it there too. Then quickly through philosophy of science again on the way back to medical ethics. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour of philosophy, I'm afraid, but I hope it'll be intelligible. I'll try to do my best. Now, some skepticism about teleology had already begun in the High Middle Ages, but it's really with Francis Bacon and the Renaissance that teleology and final causation are banned from natural philosophy or science, as it was then called. And then for a long time, biology remained explicitly and unapologetically teleological in character. But over time, biologists came more and more to emulate modern physics and to try to find a place for living things in a physical world that's purely quantitative and bottom-up in its structure. And this was quite fruitful, leading to things like the discovery, the synthesis of urea and the discovery of DNA and so on. So I accept that kind of reductionism is a useful fiction, but ultimately only that, in my view. But of course, modern biologists tend to think of it the other way around. They think that the reduction to the physical is the sober truth, and any remaining teleology in biology is a thing that's at best a useful fiction or a heuristic, leading to other discoveries. The discovery and acceptance of Darwin's theory seemed to sort of clinch matters for many people, since it offered a way of explaining why things might appear to be functional or have purposes when they don't really do so. So Huxley put it in his characteristic bluntness. That which struck the present writer most forcefully on his first perusal of the origin of species was the conviction that teleology, with a capital T, as commonly understood, had received its death blow at Mr. Darwin's hands. For the teleological argument runs thus: an organ or organism is precisely fitted to perform a function or purpose, therefore it was specially constructed to perform that purpose. Huxley and many others took Darwin's theory as a way of explaining the apparent fitness of organs for purposes while dispensing with the purposes themselves. Contemporary modern biologist, S.H.P. Medrell, put it this way: the proper but cumbersome way of describing change by evolutionary adaptation may be substituted by shorter, overtly teleological statements for the sake of saving space. But this should not be taken to imply that evolution proceeds by anything other than mutations arising by chance, with that import and advantage being retained by natural selection. So the picture is that teleology is just a useful sort of shorthand and not to be taken literally. Now the famous 20th century biologist J.B.S. Haldane put it this way: what is he supposed to have done? Teleology is like a mistress to a biologist. He cannot live without her, but he's unwilling to be seen with her in public. I hope that's still all right to say that these days. But in any case, Haldane's witticism points to an important fact. Teleological language and concepts are actually ubiquitous and eliminable in biology. So if we suppose that they are merely heuristic, we have to ask ourselves, heuristic for what? To what further discoveries do these teleological models lead? Well, the answer is only to more teleological knowledge. I think it would be crazy to suppose, well, you might think this, that all of biology is merely a useful fiction, useful only as a tool for making physical and chemical discoveries. And in fact, physics and chemistry seem to do fine on their own without the help of biology. And in any case, biology exists surely for its own sake. Biological inquiry can never escape from the teleological domain. Georg Töpfers put it this way in a recent essay. Teleology is closely connected to the concept of the organism, and therefore has its most fundamental role in the very definition of biology as a particular science of natural objects. The identity conditions of biological systems are given by functional analysis, not by chemical or physical descriptions. This means that beyond the functional perspective, which consists in specifying the system by fixing the roles of its parts, the organism does not even exist as a definite entity. And this was recognized also by the neo-Kantians in the early 20th century, that we have to define the science of biology. This is H. Rickard. this is the science as the science of bodies whose parts combine to a teleological unity. That's the very definition of biology, or the neo-Kantians. I think they're right. I'd also argue that evolution itself, contrary to Huxley's view, presupposes a strong form of teleology in the very idea of reproduction. No organism ever produces an exact physical or chemical duplicate of itself. In the case of sexual reproduction, the children are often not even close physical approximations to either parent at any stage of development. An organism successfully reproduces itself when it successfully produces another instance of the same biological kind. And these biological kinds can only be defined in terms of teleology, in terms of function. Therefore, evolution itself presupposes a form of teleological essentialism. Now, I'll illustrate this by referring to Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins suggests that organisms are mere robots that have been designed by DNA molecules to replicate themselves. But of course, in fact, as I pointed out, DNA molecules never succeed in perfectly reproducing themselves. And even if they did, mere physical duplication of the molecule would not constitute biological reproduction. Suppose you had an eccentric billionaire who built a chemical factory that does nothing but produces copies of his own genome, stacks them into barrels, and shoots them into outer space and they last forever. Surely none of us would think that he'd won the reproduction game, right, producing trillions of descendants simply by filling barrels with its own genome. A DNA molecule counts as a copy or containing copies of one's genes only when it is and its parts are successfully fulfilling the function of a gene within a living organism. Indeed, within living organisms of the appropriate teleological kind. So DNA does not actually offer a reduction of teleology of other things. Now in this paper, I'm going to defend an all-out realism about teleology. I'm going to say that the statements in biology and elsewhere are both literally true and indefinable in non-teleological terms. Now in anti-realism, my opponent can take one of two forms, either reductive or eliminative. So according to a reductive account of teleology, teleology is a real phenomenon, but in reality is identical to or constituted by certain facts that are wholly non-teleological in nature or in essence. The world is fundamentally devoid of teleology, but certain complex facts about that non-teleological world could fittingly be described in teleological language or using those concepts, so long as we aren't interested in the very essence of things, the fundamental essence of things. Now, eliminative anti-realism has a harder edge. It simply denies there are any truths at all couched in teleological terms. On that view, all teleology is at best a useful fiction, at worst an error or confusion, because that's the hard version of anti-realism. So I'm going to argue against the harder eliminative anti-teleology, anti-realism, in sections 2 and 3, and then take on the reductive version in section 4, then talk about the Aristotelean alternative in section 5, and hopefully get to medical ethics in section 6. So, and we'll see. Okay, so is teleology eliminable? Well, I've already talked about this, and I've argued that biology itself gives us good reason to reject the eliminability of teleology. It's essential to the practice of biological sciences. Now, I've also argued, and I'll skip over this here, but I've argued in several places that a teleological realism is necessary to explain the possibility of science. And you have to attribute to the human mind a certain natural function that gravitates towards truth in scientific theory, because no matter how much data we have, there's always going to be an infinite number of theories that are compatible with that data. So there has to be some sort of innate aptitude we have for picking plausibly true theories from that infinity of possible candidates. But anyway, I'll skip over that. Instead, what I'm going to focus on is philosophy of mind. So I'm going to argue that the theory of human mind requires teleology, and that will then eliminate the eliminativist position, basically. Okay, so why is this relevant? Well, because here I want to go back for a minute to what I would call the classical or Aristotelean or hylomorphic conception of the mind, and then contrast it with the kind that we get after the scientific revolution. So in the Aristotelian picture, the natural world is suffused with teleology, functionality, and normativity. Each real entity has its own natural end or purpose. And in that sort of picture, things like sensory knowledge and intentional agency are fully natural processes of a kind that are ubiquitous in nature. Now, once Bacon and Descartes and others succeeded in overturning this Aristotelian model, a new picture emerged of the so-called physical world. The physical world was now one of essentially inert quantities of matter, moved hither and thither by forces governed by strict laws of nature. Now, sensation, thought, and agency are clearly processes of a different kind from this. And that's why most early modern philosophers followed Descartes into a kind of metaphysical dualism of matter and mind. Two didn't fit together anymore, given the rejection of an Aristotelian picture. But this dualism proved to be an inhospitable halfway house, merely a step on the way towards all-out materialism. So the modern materialist is faced then with two critical problems: where to locate the qualitative aspects of reality, as encompassed in sense experience, so the problem of secondary qualities, or qualia as we call them in philosophy, and then how to ground the reality of intentionality, the aboutness of thought. And both, I think, are insoluble for the materialist. And on the first, I would again refer you to the book that Peter mentioned, that George Beeler and I edited, called The Waning of Materialism, where we collected together a number of essays I think are pretty decisive on that point. But I won't talk about that. I'll just talk about one problem that relates to intentionality tonight, just for the sake of time. Now, at this point, I'm going to draw on a paper that's forthcoming that Alexander Pruss from Baylor and I have written, that's coming out in a collection called Causal Powers, to be edited by John Jacobs, SOU. And the picture here is that really the only candidate the materialist has is something called functionalism, which is a very sophisticated development of behaviorism of the mid-20th century. So on this picture, the idea is that our theory of the mind, our theory of psychology, has got to be wholly physical, which means that the ultimate vocabulary has got to be just a physical description of the possible inputs and outputs, the possible sensory inputs and possible behavioral outputs, plus the language, a neutral language, of things like causation, probability, logic, mathematics, and so on. But nothing inherently mental, teleological, normative, qualitative. All those things are to be banned from the basic language. It's a tall order, right? But the British philosopher and logician Frank Ramsey offered the picture that I think is the most promising one for the functionalist. The problem, of course, with the original behaviorist was they tried to define each mental state in terms of an input-output relationship. And that sort of works for things like pain. You might say, okay, pain is just the state you're in when you get poked with a pin and you say, ow. Well, that sort of works. Now, of course, there are problems with that, right? Because you might get picked, stick with the pin and not say ow. You might say ow and stick to the pin if you really didn't feel the pain, and so on. But it gets really crazy if you try to apply that as a general theory of things like beliefs and intentions and desires and so on. So the answer, the functionalist answer, is that this has to be done at a holistic level. That is, you have to say, we're going to give a single theory of how the mind in general works in such a way that we can map a complete set of beliefs, desires, experiences, attitudes, and so on to a functional state, which then can be realized in the brain, and all that can be defined in terms of a complicated system of inputs and outputs. So instead of just having input-output, you have input internal state leading to output new internal state. Right? And then you quantify over the trillions or gazillions or whatever possible functional states you need in order to have a theory of mind. That's the picture. So the clauses of this Ramsey theory are going to have a form of something like the kind that I have on 1 through 4 on your handouts. If system X is in the internal state Sn, and some input state Im occurs at t, then X at the next relevant time will move to internal state Sk and output state Oj. Right? And you have trillions of little clauses like that explaining the relationship between inputs, outputs, and internal states. Now, one is stated in terms of an indicative conditional, if this, then that, or if this always happens, then that always happens. Well, it turns out that doesn't work very well because, at least as logicians understand indicative conditionals, if the if part is always false, the conditional is true. And so if something is in a situation where it never goes into input state I or never has an internal state, automatically satisfies one, so you end up with things like rocks and plates having minds and so on. That's not good. So it's more plausible to go with something like 2, where we have a subjunctive conditional. If the system were in this internal state and some input occurs, then it would move into the appropriate internal state output. So that eliminates that problem of what we call vacuously true conditionals. Or you might go all the way to something like dispositions. If it's in a certain internal state, it has a disposition to move to another internal state and to output something given an input. Or we can talk about causal powers. So these are different ways of getting at this this idea of a transition from an internal state to an output to a new internal state. Now, what's wrong with all that? Well, there's lots of problems. There are many, many arguments. And again, the Beeler-Koons volume includes a lot of them. But I'll focus just on this one that Alex Pruss and I developed. And it basically adapts, well, I'll start out with this example. So suppose that I've got a bomb attached to myself that's connected to a brain scanner of some sort, in such a way that if I ever go into internal state Sn and have input state Im, it blows up. Right? Well, the bomb is going to falsify conditional 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? I now no longer have the disposition to move to the appropriate output states because the bomb goes off every time that happens. Yet intuitively, the mere presence of the bomb with that brain scanner doesn't prevent me from having thoughts and beliefs and desires and so on. So it looks like there's something wrong there. Now we might say, oh, well, that's because you can't talk about, well, you might just, a simple solution would be to say, well, let's add, and the thing survives until time t plus 1. You probably want that anyway, right? Because otherwise, ants get squished when they're in the input state, will falsify the conditionals. Okay, so fair enough. So now we have to complicate things a little bit further. So here's another thought experiment. Here what we do is we steal an idea from Harry Frankfurt, Princeton philosopher, who developed this thought experiment to show that there's a problem with the idea that free will requires alternate possibilities. And so the Frankfurt picture is there's a neuromanipulator out there who's scanning my brain. And for some reason he wants to make sure that I let's say, eat this, what is that, fig or something, right? Olive, eat that olive, okay. And so it turns out I freely decide to eat the olive, why not, right? I exercise my free will, I eat the olive and so on. But the neuromanipulator was scanning this thing, and if it turned out that I was going down a path that was a non-olive eating path, he would manipulate my brain so that I would eat the olive. So in fact, it turns out to be impossible for me not to eat the olive, right, given the neuromanipulator. But let's say in the actual world, he does nothing, right? So it just proceeds as normal. I think I want to eat the olive, I do eat the olive. It looks as though I'm still acting freely, even though there are no alternative possibilities. So now apply the same idea here as a way to create a problem for functionalism. So now you've got a neuromanipulator that wants to make sure that that some of these conditionals, 1 through 4, are falsified. Right? For some reason, he's going to interfere if the conditional's antecedent is verified. He's going to make sure that the output is falsified, so that the mere existence of this manipulator falsifies a bunch of these conditionals and deprives the thing of any sort of mental states, even if the manipulator never does anything, right? Even if you never encounter the situations in which he has to interfere, right? That seems counterintuitive. Again, I mean, I'm just doing my thing, thinking, feeling, experiencing, and so on. The manipulator's out there. His presence is enough to falsify enough of these conditionals that I no longer count as a mind. And yet, come on, I'm still a mind. I still have thoughts and feelings. So it looks as though that's going to be a real problem for functionalists. Now you might say, oh, well, the problem is that he's an external manipulator, right? Well, then you just build him into my nervous system somehow. I get some kind of weird brain tumor that also scans my brain and messes up the various conditionals, but never does anything, right? And so as long as it never does anything and my brain continues to function, it looks like it doesn't interfere with my sensations and so on. Now, right. Now you might say, look, this, now we can get into a question here about, what's the purpose of these sorts of thought experiments, right? And again, remember that the functionalist is not merely saying, here's an interesting theory about how the mind works. He's saying, this is the very essence of being a mind, is that you satisfy these conditionals, right? So if we can come up with a case where you can satisfy those conditionals or falsify them, and yet you clearly are or aren't a mind in a way that contradicts the functionalist theory, that's a real problem for functionalism, I think. This is a classic philosophical argument, mode of argument going all the way back to Socrates, right? So I think it's fair enough. But I think it also can generalize beyond these kind of crazy thought experiments, because human beings, in fact, are subject to all kinds of malfunctioning. There's been injury and illness of various kinds. None of us is ever going to fully satisfy the ideal theory of the mind, right? And yet surely that's not enough to deprive us of having a mind altogether. So it looks as though what the functionalist is going to have to do in order to solve this problem, we argue, is introduce an idea of normality in the picture. So in 1 and 2 or 3, instead of just saying, if you're in this situation, you would produce that, you say, if you're in this situation and you are in a normal state and your environment is normal, then you would go to this other internal state and produce the appropriate output, right? Some sort of notion of normality is going to be needed. And in fact, that's exactly what an Aristotelian can have. So my argument here then is going to be, say, look, once you start talking about normal, what a thing normally does, you've subtly reintroduced the idea of teleology. Right? That is, a thing that does something normally when it's functioning the way it's supposed to function. Right? And that, again, is teleological notion. So the overall lesson that we want to draw from that is that the very best option on the table for avoiding teleology ends up requiring it in the end, in order to save it against these counterexamples. Okay, so now remember, all that's against the eliminative anti-teleologist, the one who wants to eliminate it altogether. I haven't said anything yet about the reductive view. Right? So that's what we're going to look at in section 4. Could we say, okay, fine, we need some sort of notion of normativity, and that requires teleology, but we can still fit that within a totally physical world in the modern sense. We can explain it all in non-teleological terms, and so nothing mysterious or spooky is going to be required. Okay, well, how would that go? Well, again, the Aristotelian, let me start with him, with that position. The Aristotelian is going to give a pretty straightforward account of normativity. So if an agent, a substance in Aristotle's picture, has a certain causal power, which is a sort of power which, when in a certain situation, typically results in a certain effect. So from a C to E, kind of causal power, basically. Then it's going to, but a normal situation is a situation in which that power is not interfered with, it's not blocked in some sort of way. So the Aristotelian picture is one in which things have causal powers. When those causal powers are exercised, that's the normal situation. But those powers can be blocked and interfered with in various ways. And when that happens, then you're in a situation that's abnormal. So there's a certain ensemble of powers that a human being has, but in certain cases, if our bodies are damaged in various ways, some of those causal powers can no longer be exercised. Right? So that's the picture. Now, notice that the Aristotelian notion doesn't actually require any sort of design. So the idea is not teleology implies design, which implies a designer. And again, this is where the people in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period were confused. They thought that that was required, and I think they rightly objected to that. But Aristotle, and this is also pretty clear in Avicenna or Aquinas as well, say that no, you don't have to suppose anything about that. You just have to suppose that there's something. You have to buy into what we would call now a causal powers picture of how agents work. Now, this does involve something that's somewhat mysterious, as George Molnar has pointed out in his book Powers. Because if you say that, let's say you say that an electron has a power of repelling other negatively charged things, then there is a kind of intentionality that's built right into the electron. Even if the electron is never near another negatively charged particle ever, it retains the power to repel it, right? It's as if, go away, negative charged things. It's sort of built into its very nature, right? A kind of reference to a possible future state is built right in there. And that's what Aristotelian means by teleology, that's what they mean by normativity. And that's exactly the sort of thing that the early modern picture tried to get rid of and to replace with the notion of laws of nature in such a way that you didn't need these occult qualities, mysterious notions of powers. Okay, so that's the Aristotelian picture. Now, what's the alternative? Again, as far as I know, there's only one option for the teleological reductionist, and that is, again, to appeal to evolutionary history or natural selection. So you could argue that a system has, basically the normal functioning of a system is defined by its evolutionary history. So I'm functioning normally if I'm exercising the adaptations that my species acquired in the course of evolutionary history. And this has been proposed by a number of philosophers in recent years. Ruth Garrett Millikan is a famous one in her book Language, Thought, and Other Biological Categories. But similar accounts have been made by Larry Wright, Karen Neander, and many others. So I think I've got up to section 5, thesis 5, second page of the paper. This is a slightly simplified version, believe it or not, of Millikan's proposal of how you can give an evolutionary account of normativity. Right? So the idea is a thing is supposed to produce E in circumstances I. So again, that's the teleological sense it's supposed to. If and only if X belongs to some reproductive family R, so family of things that reproduce themselves. You may remember, given what I said earlier, that's already teleological, so she shouldn't say that, but we'll let that pass. It's already made that point a couple times, so I won't repeat it again. But I think that's a problem. In which some feature C occurs non-accidentally. 2, there's been a positive correlation between having that feature and producing E in circumstances I. And this is the crucial part. This positive correlation has been in part causally responsible for the successful survival and proliferation of family R, including X itself. So in other words, there's something about this transition from I to what they call it, E, right? Which figured in the evolutionary history of X's own species, so to speak, and contributed to its successful survival and reproduction, right? So, the eye is supposed to process visual information in a certain way, electromagnetic radiation, right? Why do we say that? Well, because I had ancestors where it did in fact do that. The fact that it did that contributed to their ability to survive and reproduce, and that's why my eye is supposed to do it, even if it fails to do it at some point. Right? So that's the picture. Okay, so as I said, I already think that's a problem because you can't define reproduction physically, so there's a circularity problem there. A second objection is that this definition has the somewhat implausible consequence that mental functioning is always one generation delayed, so to speak. So imagine my ancestor, let's call him Sim, who first has some functioning thing like an eye, right? And so Sim takes in all this visual information, survives successfully, passes that gene on to his descendants. Great, his descendants see, right? His descendants have eyes that are functional. Sim doesn't, right? Because Sim doesn't have any ancestors in whom this very thing function in that sort of way. And so that is the consequence, I think, that any sort of mental state or mental facility is going to be epiphenomenal. It has to correlate with some brain stuff that's useful for reproduction, but it itself is actually useless because it just comes along as it doesn't add anything itself to the function of these things. Okay, so but let me go on to the third objection. This is the more interesting one, I think. So first of all, we have to ask, well, what does it mean to say that this correlation between the input and the output contributes or causes to a particular case of reproduction? Well, it's not enough to say that there was just some ancestor who had this feature and that ancestor survived, so that makes it count. That's too broad, right? So suppose some ancestral rabbit was hit by a cosmic ray and its leg twitched right while it was collecting some carrots. Well, you wouldn't want to say that, okay, that's now the function of that part of the brain of the rabbit is to cause the leg to twitch when there's a cosmic ray because, in fact, it's associated with this event. I mean, no one would say that, right? And so what we really want is contrastive explanation. That is, we want to say that because the rabbit does a certain thing, that explains why that rabbit reproduced itself successfully, right? As opposed to not reproducing, right? So there has to be a comparison here between having the thing and reproducing, not having it and not reproducing, a contrastive explanation. But once you accept that, then there's a potential problem. And so here's our second little thought experiment. This is also from the Koons paper that's coming out this year. Now here I need to take on board a couple sort of technical notions here. Let's say that a region of space-time, R, is impotent, provided that nothing in R can affect what happens in space-time outside of R. So the idea is that a region of space is impotent if it just can't affect anything outside of that region of space. Right? So it's some other dimension that things can go to, but they can't come back. They can't have any influence back from them. Okay, now I want you to buy into principle 6 here on the handout, the almost global supervenience of physical minds. So suppose world 1 and world 2 are exact physical duplicates, except in some impotent region of space-time. Then W1 contains an instance of having a mind outside of R, if and only if W2 contains an exactly similar instance outside of R. So the idea is whether one world has a mind in it at a particular place outside of R can't depend on what's going on in R if that has no causal connection to what's going on in the mind, or a supposed mind, right? Distant, causally unrelated stuff can't affect whether you've got a mind or not. And that seems pretty plausible, I think. Now, here's the sort of science fiction part of the thought experiment, right? Suppose we've got a world W1, which it has a planet like the Earth, and the history on the Earth looks exactly like you'd expect, exactly like Peter would expect, all the way back, right? Pretty much exactly, point by point. But there's this weird fact about world 1, which is there's this other dimension called the Great Grazing Ground. And whenever a living organism on Earth is about to die, it's somehow or other teleported to the Great Grazing Ground and replaced by a very similar corpse-like object. Okay? And in world W1, it goes to the great grazing ground and then dies there. Okay, it's not that interesting, you might say. The only difference between world 1 and the actual world is that nothing actually dies in Earth in world 2. It just goes to this other dimension and dies there. End of story. Okay. Now, world 2 is just like world 1, except now the great grazing ground is inhabited by some benevolent aliens, who as soon as these Earth creatures arrive there in this moribund state, they patch it up again and make sure that it lives not only then but forever, and they make sure that it can reproduce itself. So even if it's too old to reproduce itself, they fix that up, and so it has infinitely many descendants in the great grazing ground, and their descendants have descendants, and so on. So it's an evolutionary perfect world. Okay. Well, in that world, in world W2, there's no natural selection whatsoever, because everything maximally reproduces itself. And so there's no contrastive explanation. Therefore, in world 2, eyes are not for seeing, stomachs are not for digesting, nothing contributes to reproduction at all, because nothing can contribute to reproduction. It's already maxed out, thanks to the great grazing ground. And that means that in world 2, there can't be any kind of functionality or normativity, and that means there can't be any minds in world 2. No experience, no thoughts, no beliefs. But world 2 is just like world 1. We already agreed in world 1, it's just like the Earth, right? There has to be Earth, there has to be beliefs and sensations and so on. So the moral of the story is that what's wrong with the Millikan-like definition is that it makes whether or not you have a mind depend on stuff that goes on in some remote part of space-time, right? I mean, it just makes it very vivid, right? Because in Millikan's case, it's some remote part of evolutionary history and so on. This just makes up, or the descendants of some of those remote parts of that history. This just makes that more explicit and I think brings out in a more vivid way the fact that it just doesn't seem like a plausible account. Okay, so in any case, that's one argument among many that I think creates real problems for the functionalist. So that means that we need to go back to Aristotelian metaphysics. That's section 5, right? Aristotelians never faced the problem of naturalizing the mind, so we just have to reverse engineer the Aristotelian solution and apply it to modern problems. And the fundamental difference between Aristotelians and the modern materialist metaphysicians lies in their different conceptions of causation, as I explained. If we get causation, causal powers right, we get teleology right, and we get normativity, we get mind, and everything else falls into place. Now modern philosophy took its most decisive step away from Aristotle when David Hume attacked the very idea of causal powers. And there have been, although Hume himself is a skeptic about causation in general, there's been a school of thought in modern philosophy of people called neo-Humeans who attempt to give a kind of reductive account of causation that also eliminates causal powers and appeals simply to laws of nature. And so for reasons of time, I won't be able to go through this, but there's a number of us who are pushing back hard on this, and I think there's a number of pretty good philosophical arguments for thinking that the Humeans or neo-Humeans are wrong, and that there's a revival of causal powers kind of thinking going on, which is all to the good, in my opinion. Okay, so now let me say something briefly about physics and chemistry, and then get to medical ethics. So I'm going to go a little bit over, but I think I'm all right. Okay, so biological teleology requires, I think, just two things. A causal powers metaphysics, the kind that I've described, and causal powers at the level of organisms and organs. Right? So you could, if you're a causal power theorist and you think that the only things that have causal powers are microparticles, then you're sort of an Aristotelian, but not really, right? Because you're not going to be able to explain biological normativity or biological functionality, right? So you need that as well. Now, given the importance and success of biology itself, it seems to me that it's perfectly reasonable for us to extend the idea of teleology to living organisms. Plus, the argument I just gave against functionalism suggested that we need causal powers at the level of human beings, conscious beings, and it seems very reasonable to extend it from us to other living organisms as well. That if it works for human beings, it's needed there. Pretty good reason to think it should be needed in other cases as well. In addition, I would argue, and this is the project I'm working on this year, that the emergence of new powers at the biological scale should be unsurprising, given that given according to our most recent quantum mechanical models, we see emergence of powers at the mesoscopic scale in solid-state physics and in chemistry. So mesoscopic systems like superconductors and Bose-Einstein condensates and chemical molecules all exhibit dynamical behavior in the form of symmetry breaking and thermodynamic irreversibility and other things that are in fact irreducible to the dynamics of the constituent microparticles. Irreducible, I think, not just in practice, but in principle. That's a subject for another paper. In any case, if that's true, then we've got a new picture emerging in which you have emergentism all over the place, so to speak. Chemistry, solid-state physics, biology, the philosophy of mind, maybe sociology, other stuff as well. Okay, if teleology at the biological level is real and irreducible, does it have any practical consequences? Well, I think it does, as the famous function argument from Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics indicates. If human beings have a teleologically structured essence, then our faculty of will, our capacity to make choices, is itself a biological function with a built-in ordering to some fixed end, which we call happiness or eudaimonia. And we have good reason, I think, from biology to believe that these built-in functions are harmonious, that typically they're mutually supportive. And so we would imagine that the natural function of the will is going to be supportive of the natural functioning of our other organs and organic systems, that is, of our health. That health is a good for human beings. Now, medicine's function, I think, should be the service. I mean, given that health is an objective ideal toward which all rightly ordered volition is compatible, it seems to me appropriate that there should be a profession or a craft or a practice that's devoted exclusively to the protection and promotion of health in that sense. Historically, that's been the defining mission of medicine. I would say that's the Hippocratic conception of medicine, right? There's this objective good, which is health. Medicine is that profession which is directed towards that objective good. Now, if that's true, then medicine should not be thought of as organic engineering, as an industry whose end is the satisfaction of consumer demand for any sort of organic change. Not all desires and inclinations are equally worthy of respect, especially as a physician. The ethical physician should not indulge in desires for inhuman or transhumanist manipulations of the body. Instead, the physician should count such desires as pathologies to be treated, not as consumer demand to be met. So the ethical physician, on my view, must always ask, am I treating a disease, a defect in the natural functioning of the body? Am I helping my patient to return to the path of true health as defined by human nature, that is, by that package of emergent causal powers that constitute the shared structure of human life? Do I refuse to collaborate in my patient's self-destructive choices, even when doing so might be legal or fashionable? And if we do think of medicine in those terms, it seems to me there are many practices and procedures that are either in actuality now or may exist in the future, which just do not belong within the practice of medicine. So I'll end with a very controversial and provocative point here. The termination of healthy pregnancies is not contributing to health, I think. Sterilization, artificial contraception, except as part of a treatment of some disease. So fertility is not a disease, and therefore the elimination of fertility is not medicine. Plastic surgery that's based on matters of contingent taste and not on the restoration of essential human functioning. So obviously if somebody's lacking a face, then it's reasonable to reconstruct the face. But if it's a purely aesthetic preference, it's hard to me see why that's counted for medicine any more than tattooing or piercing should be part of that. I mean, maybe it is in some places, I don't know, but it would be no more appropriate than that. Sex change operations in which the actual sexual organs are already consonant with the patient's genetic makeup. It's not a disease, as far as I can tell. And prosthetic or pharmacological enhancements designed not to cure disease, but supposedly to improve the performance of muscles, skeleton, sense organ, and brain, and so on. Again, this is more science fiction-y perspective things. And I might add euthanasia. Again, I think life is not a disease. Right? Killing is not a cure. And so that's inappropriate as a part of medicine. Okay, stop there. Thanks so much for your attention.
Great.